Over the first 3 episodes of our investigation into the cost of homelessness, we've discussed how housing the homeless can cost less than serving them through the emergency system. And while that's often true, it isn't necessarily the case for every person, for every housing program, or in every location. And the purpose of ending homelessness isn't primarily to save money. It's to improve the health and quality of life of individuals and society at large. Today we're joined by one of the world's leading experts on measuring the cost of homelessness, Dr. Eric Latimer, who can help us be more rigorous and accurate. Perhaps by understanding the evidence in a cautious and even conservative way, we can start to build consensus around the costs of homelessness and the benefits of ending it. Dr. Latimer was lead economist on the largest Canadian study looking at the cost of homelessness, which measured the cost-effectiveness of a program called Housing First. While over half the cost of the housing intervention was offset by reductions in other service uses, shelters, hospitals, jails, it did not, in this case, offset 100% of the cost. We discussed some of the reasons for this. One is that the Housing First program connected people to income assistance and desperately needed healthcare, which are costs that are good and beneficial. A second reason is that while some studies really target high-need, high-cost people, Dr. Latimer purposefully also included people with more moderate needs. And a third reason we discuss is called regression to the mean. People who entered the study were homeless when enrolled. And since people in general have their ups and downs in life, some in the control group got housing on their own, in this case, 30% of them. But even taking all this into account, the people who went into the Housing First program improved their lives even more. They were 2 to 3 times more likely to be stably housed, and their service use went down as well, offsetting up to 70% of the Housing First program costs for people with high needs, and about 50% for people with moderate needs. We also compare these results to other studies that found cost neutrality, such as Dr. Culhane's in the US that we've discussed previously, and another large Housing First randomized trial in France. It does seem that, particularly for people with high needs, and in certain settings, housing the homeless can pay for itself. Furthermore, these research studies tend to use a 2-year time period, and Dr. Latimer discusses projections that suggest that, if we take a longer view, ending homelessness more than pays for itself. That said, he also emphasizes many reasons why cost savings or cost neutrality should not be the goal, putting it bluntly that if we're willing to invest healthcare dollars into expensive treatments like end-of-life care or treatments for people who live unhealthy lives, all of which we should do, it is inconsistent that we neglect to invest the modest amount required to prevent and end homelessness. About Eric Latimer himself, he's a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at McGill University and research scientist at the Douglas Mental Health University Institute. And he was lead investigator of the Montreal site of the at-home Chez Soi study, which we're discussing today, and as mentioned, he was its lead economist nationally. I learned an enormous amount through this conversation, and every time I come back to it, it helps me to think about things in a new way. Let me know what you think by emailing policycrimes@thepublication.ca. Here's Dr. Eric Latimer. Welcome, Eric Latimer, to our series on the cost of homelessness.
Thank you for inviting me.
Before we discuss the big Housing First trial, can you define what Housing First is as compared to, say, transitional housing or also supportive housing?
Sure. Housing First is an approach to housing people experiencing homelessness that involves skipping over any transitional settings, emergency housing, whatever, and helping them find directly permanent housing and helping them move into, it's usually an apartment, right away, without any preconditions in terms of sobriety or whatever. So the assumption in doing that is that it'll be easier for the person to make progress in different spheres of their life if they are housed and have some supports within that housing than if you put them in a less permanent kind of setting. That's the essence of the thing. There are 2 variants or 2 flavors, if I can put it that way, for Housing First. One is where the housing is in an ordinary apartment building. And the other variant is one where you have purpose-built housing for people who were experiencing homelessness, and you put them into that building. So Sam Tsimberis, who's kind of really the originator of the scattered site flavor or variant of Housing First, argues that really is the preferable way to do Housing First. It definitely is what people generally prefer.
Whatever the case, whether it's in an apartment building or in purpose-built building, the name Housing First suggests that people are able to access the housing regardless of other factors. Whereas in the past, maybe people had to transition through different forms of temporary housing and prove that they were sober or whatever. So to me, Housing First, regardless of the structure of the building, is about setting people up with housing first and then helping them to address their issues. Is that fair?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
So you looked at the cost of homelessness in a big study in Canada called At Home Chez Soi, and that was the largest and most rigorous economic evaluation of Housing First that's been undertaken to date. Can you tell us about how that study came to be and what the study design was?
Sure. The impetus for this study actually came from the 2010 Olympics in Vancouver. During the Olympics, the eyes of the world are usually focused on the particular city where the Olympics are held, and a federal official started worrying that the downtown east side and the homelessness problem in general in Vancouver would look pretty bad internationally. And this was the spark that led to the federal government contacting Michael Kirby, who was at the time the head of the Mental Health Commission of Canada, who proposed to him that funding for a study to address homelessness in Canada could be provided. Michael Kirby, in turn, contacted the late Paula Goering, who was arguably the best-known, most prominent mental health services researcher in Canada at the University of Toronto. And Paula contacted some other people, and the study was designed. Funding for the study was announced in the 2008 budget of the Harper government. So on the study design, so it was a very expensive study. It was $110 million at the time in Canadian dollars. About 85% of that was to set up some new services, support services and rent supplements, and the rest was going to go to research. The people that this was addressed to were people who were absolutely homeless or currently precariously housed, but with a recent history of absolute homelessness. They were not necessarily chronic. They were recruited from many sources. And the design, you mentioned that the study was very rigorous. It took the form of a randomized trial. So participants in each of the 5 cities where the study was held, which were Vancouver, Winnipeg, Toronto, Montreal, and Moncton, New Brunswick. Participants were divided into high need and moderate need participants. I should say in Moncton, there was just one need level. So the high need participants were people with a psychotic mental illness who were lower functioning. Moderate need had some people with psychosis, but a higher level of functioning, and some people with major depression or a variety of severe anxiety disorders. So in fact, the study consisted in 2 simultaneous randomized trials in each of Vancouver, Winnipeg, Toronto, and Montreal, and 1 randomized trial in Moncton. And there were altogether over 2,100 participants, more in the moderate need group than the high need group. And the experimental participants in the high need group received Housing First with an intensive kind of support called assertive community treatment. That includes a psychiatrist and nurses, whereas the moderate need participants got, despite the name, a somewhat less intensive kind of support called intensive case management, with a ratio of staff to clients or to participants of about 1 to 17 instead of 1 to 8 or 10. The follow-up lasted for up to 2 years, and there was a lot of questionnaires, including detailed assessments of service use that were collected, depending on the type of resource, every 3 months or every 6 months. Medications, however, we ended up not being able to incorporate into the analysis. And we adopted a social cost perspective. That is, we tallied all the costs, including social assistance payments, and we subtracted from that any legal earnings of the participants that told us about. And we also did, and I'll end with that, we also did in-depth qualitative interviews on participants at baseline and about 18 months later on 180 participants.
Right. So to summarize the study design, it was a random controlled trial. So one group got the Housing First program and the other group did not get it. They got treatment as usual.
That's right.
And overall, within both of those groups, there are some with high needs and some with lower needs, in a nutshell. And you were measuring all kinds of service uses through your surveys and all that. So to move on to your findings, what were the findings in terms of how the Housing First affected their housing stability and their service use?
Well, in terms of housing stability, I mean, the first thing to say is that what we saw was not something like totally neat and cut and dried, where everybody in the Housing First group was immediately stably housed for the rest of the study, and everybody in the control group stayed in a street or in shelters for the rest of the study. It wasn't exactly like that, but what we can say is that in the last 6 months of follow-up, from about 18 to 24 months, a bit more than 60% of the Housing First participants were stably housed all the time, compared to just over 30% in the TAU group, in the treatment as usual group. So there were people in the treatment as usual group who were able to access stable housing and stayed in it by the end of the study. It's just only about half as many as in the Housing First group. And the Housing First group tended to access stable housing a lot faster. And at the other end of the spectrum, there was just over 15% of Housing First participants that were stably housed none of the time in the Housing First group, compared to more than 45%, 3 times as many in a control group. So that's in terms of stability of housing. It was definitely better for the Housing First group.
So to summarize that, on average, the people who were in the Housing First program were stably housed for twice as long. And there was way fewer people in the Housing First program who never got housed.
That's right.
If you didn't get Housing First, you were 3 times more likely to remain homeless through the study, basically.
To be homeless in the last 6 months of the study. Yeah. So that's in terms of housing stability. So now, what about other differences this may have made? Well, the quantitative measures, the results rather surprised us. We did see some improvements in 2 measures, a general quality of life and level of functioning, which was assessed by the interviewer at the end of the interview. So we did see some difference between the groups on those measures, but on the other measures, including notably for what our topic here today, health-related quality of life, which gives us QALYs, quality-adjusted life years, we didn't see a difference between the 2 groups. And I remember one dinner with Paula Goering, and Sam Tsimberis was there too, and others as well, and we were kind of debating what is going on here. Why are we not seeing more effect? And Sam thought, well, it's probably just that we're not measuring the right things. And I think what supports that interpretation is that when we looked at the qualitative interviews, these sort of in-depth narrative stories of what had been the experiences of participants after they were housed, the differences become much more obvious. It's just that people's stories are so different from each other that it's hard to kind of summarize them with sort of simple quantitative measures. But I remember actually reading the report that my colleague Christopher McCall had written on the narrative interviews at the Montreal site, and it brought tears to my eyes, some of the stories that you heard of this person who's talking about being in their apartment and being able to do some painting, some artistic painting, and while listening to music that he likes on his radio, kind of the sense of peace and security he was experiencing, for example, or others who were able to make new friends, etc. So when all these 180 narrative interviews were analyzed, what emerged is that about 60% of the Housing First participants experienced mostly positive life trajectories over the course of the study versus half, 30%, of treatment as usual participants. And at the other extreme, only 10%, mostly negative trajectories versus more than a third of treatment as usual participants. So basically, the intervention really seems to be helpful for a lot of participants, but not necessarily everybody. We had a few exceptions. For example, a woman moves into her apartment and her predatory ex-partner finds her and makes her life miserable. Or we had some people with paranoid schizophrenia who had a great deal of difficulty trusting the staff. For some people, special arrangements had to be made. For example, in Moncton, they set up a residence with 24-hour security, cameras, etc., to protect women who were fearful of being aggressed by ex-partners. Some people who had cognitive impairments, in some cases due to drug use, had to be put into supportive housing with 24-hour staff support. So it was a lot better, though it wasn't a panacea. I think that's a good way to summarize it. The rule of thumb that people in the field use to summarize the effectiveness of Housing First is that it works for about 80% of participants, as is. And then for others, you have to find other forms of support.
To summarize the findings in terms of the impact on the individual participants in Housing First, they were more stably housed, and the qualitative data showed that they had positive life trajectories relative to the control group. And in our previous episodes, we've been talking about the cost of homelessness in terms of service utilization, like health, social, and criminal justice costs to all levels of government. And you did look at that.
Sure. We had very detailed questionnaires that captured different kinds of resource use, ranging from nights in shelters or different kinds of housing to different kinds of healthcare services, interactions with the police, appearances in court, as well as income. Fairly detailed questions on income, both from government sources, from illegal sources such as drug trafficking and others. And then we costed these various kinds of services. And then our approach to combining all the numbers was to use an approach that we can call social cost, which is not exactly the same thing as something that's commonly used that's called a societal perspective. And in this approach, what we did is we added all the costs that we were able to measure, including government transfers like disability benefits or social assistance benefits. And we subtracted from that legal income, so kind of employment income, basically. So,
and why did you subtract that?
Well, because all the other costs represent resources used up over the course of, let's say, a year in association with keeping this person alive during that year. But if the person works, then it's making a contribution that counterbalances all those costs. For most people of working age, certainly people who are in the labor force, then the economic value of what they produce will exceed the value of what they consume. I mean, we pay taxes, so that reduces right there the amount that we consume. So with people who are not working and who are relatively high users of public services, then the difference flips and it becomes net positive cost. The only other thing I'll add is most of the costs that we added up were borne by the government. The main exception is the cost of services that were provided by nonprofits, such as emergency shelters. While those costs are not usually funded simply by the government, but also usually by private donors, foundations, etc. So we counted the full cost. So in that respect, we were closer to what's called a societal perspective that tries to look at all the resources expended by society. The main difference between the way we did it and the societal perspective is that we counted the government transfers, which the societal perspective would not have counted.
What difference did that approach make to the findings or the outcomes?
If we had not included social assistance and disability benefits in our calculations and had something that was more like the true societal perspective, then we would have actually increased the cost effectiveness. In other words, reduced the cost per day stably housed, because the Housing First intervention led to the case managers helping some people access social assistance or disability benefits. We increased the cost of the intervention a little bit by doing that. So the intervention would look cheaper per additional day of stable housing.
Yeah, so it's another example of being cautious and conservative, perhaps, in this study, or rigorous.
Yes, that's fair. That's fair. I hadn't thought about it that way before. It's a very good question.
We talked to Dennis Culhane, who did the first big study in the States, and he found that the cost of homelessness was about $70,000 on average. So what did you find in terms of the cost of homelessness and what the service utilization cost offsets were in this big study?
We found a cost that was somewhat lower than in Dennis Culhane's study. It varied across cities. It ranged from about $30,000 per year in Moncton to nearly $60,000 per year in Toronto. This is in 2016 Canadian dollars. It doesn't include medications, which from some Montreal data would tag on probably about $3,000 per year per person. So somewhat lower costs. But I think we have to keep in mind that the samples were somewhat different. In the At Home Chez Soi study, as I mentioned, we had a mixture of people with moderate needs who did not necessarily have the most severe kinds of mental illness, people who are not necessarily chronically homeless. So some people really didn't cost all that much, mixed with some people who were very expensive. In the Culhane study, while I don't think they were necessarily chronic either, but they were all people with severe mental illness. So they would tend to be relatively more expensive people. So I'm not very surprised at that difference in cost, but we're still in the same general ballpark.
I think I ran your numbers with inflation in today's dollars, and it was in the mid 60,000, so it's not too far off. I don't think.
It's not too far off. They're Canadian dollars, but
True.
we're roughly in the same ballpark. We both have fairly comprehensive sets of services included. Now, how about I talk a bit about the cost offsets?
Yes,
So
please.
So what we found there is that for moderate need participants, there were significant reductions in the costs of shelters and supportive housing, which isn't surprising because we were housing people in apartments, so they didn't need those other kinds of housing. And on the health side, what really kind of emerged that's statistically significant, more than $1,000 per person on average as a savings, was substance use treatment and ambulatory visits. In the case of high-need participants, it was the same types of services with the exception that we didn't see a significant cost offset for treatment for substance abuse, but we did see one for incarcerations. So there were more people in a high-need group who had like a history of criminal justice involvement, so that's not so surprising. So in terms of the overall, once you sum it up and turn it into dollars and magnitude of cost offset. For moderate need participants, the intervention cost about $14,500 per person per year, and 46% of that was offset on average across the cities, was offset by the intervention. So the net cost was just under $8,000 per person. But that, of course, is like agglomerating all these different costs, which, as you were discussing in detail with Dennis Culhane, like accrue to different payers. So there's really no single payer who sees all that. So some of it is municipal, some of it is provincial, a little bit of it is federal. And then at the high need level, the intervention was more expensive. It was just over $20,000 per person per year. 69% of the cost was offset. So quite a larger percentage, 69 versus 46, reducing the net cost for the moderate need people to just over $6,300 per person per year. So that's basically what we find. So we did not find that the intervention fully paid for itself. It resulted in savings that, if I combine the two groups, add up to like roughly half the cost of the intervention, was offset, was compensated by reductions in costs of other things, but not 100%.
That shouldn't be too surprising that the high needs group, almost 70% of the housing interventions cost was offset by service savings. And for the more moderate needs, it was still almost 50% of the cost was offset. Many studies conclude that housing people costs less than the cost of keeping people homeless. And while that may be the case for certain populations, it's not always the case. And many studies showing a huge cost saving are comparing the straight cost of people being homeless versus the cost of housing them, which is probably good to know. But many of these studies overestimate the savings because of what you call regression to the mean. Can you explain what that means?
Yes, sure. The term regression to the mean comes from the 19th century when an English researcher observed that the sons of tall fathers, unusually tall fathers, fathers who were taller than average, tended to be of closer to average height. And the sons of short fathers tended to be taller than their fathers, closer to average height. So that's where the term regression to the mean comes from. Applied to our context, what we observe is that in studies that follow a before and after design, where you just take a group of people who are homeless, you recruit them into your study, you house them, you measure their costs before they got housed, and then you measure their costs after they got housed, and you find, lo and behold, they cost a lot less after they were housed. So you conclude housing made a huge difference. But there's very good reason to believe that at least part of that effect is due to this regression to the mean phenomenon. We can see that in a trial such as at Chez Soi, where systematically people recruited to the control group experience reductions in days homeless and in costs following entry into the study, even though we're not doing anything to them except we are interviewing them periodically. But I asked our interviewers, do you think that's making much of a difference? And their feeling was like, this was such a small part of their overall lives. It's just an interview every 3 months for which they get really a minimal amount of money. They found it very hard to imagine that could have any impact on them. So we see this phenomenon of when you've recruited people into a study and their costs go down all by themselves without you doing anything. So why would that be? The way we understand what's likely going on here is that people go up and down in their lives. And when we recruit them into a study, it's at a time when they're not doing well. And in fact, if we think about the At Home Chez Soi study, some of the people we recruited had recently become homeless. They really were homeless at that point. They had no prospects of being able to get out of homelessness. But the fact is that regular services do help many people to exit homelessness. So we recruited people at a point when they were homeless. Some of them would have gotten out of homelessness without even any help. There are also people who are periodically homeless, like cyclically homeless. And those individuals we would have recruited at a point where they were homeless and they were going to get out of homelessness on their own or with some help from mutual services. So it's the same thing in a before and after design. When you're recruiting people, you're recruiting them when they're not doing well and they're going to get better. You'd probably see the same thing if you did a trial on depression. You recruit people when they're feeling very depressed. Well, a lot of people who experience depression have periods when they're feeling very depressed and other periods when they're feeling a lot better. So that's why it's so important to do randomized trials to compare the two groups.
So in this study, the At Home Chez Soi study, people were recruited into the study when they were homeless, in many cases at their lowest point. And just naturally, what you found was actually 30% became housed through the study. Is that right?
Right. 30% in the final 6 months were housed the whole time, as opposed to about double for the Housing First group.
And then the Housing First group, 2/3 or more of them were stably housed by the end of the study. So the intervention worked, but because you were subtracting out that 30% that would have happened anyway, in some cases, you might see a lower effectiveness or cost saving than if you had ignored that regression to the mean. Am I getting it right?
If we had not taken into account this regression to the mean, the effect of Housing First on cost would look a lot bigger. So that's why instead of the intervention looking cost saving, it actually looks more like the truth is that it did increase costs somewhat over that 2-year horizon.
I personally think it's so important to talk about this research that was so cautious and so rigorous. And part of the reason for me is that we don't seem to have a consensus among government and society about what to do, and people might have reservations. So when people are listening to this podcast, they might hear at first, oh, the cost saving was not as huge as you see in some other studies. But the way I think about it is that you're really rigorous, subtracted out the regression to the mean, also included income assistance as part of your analysis. And you did all of that just to be really sure. And you still saw cost offsets. You still saw over half of the cost offset. You saw a huge improvement in people's lives and cost effectiveness. So I just want to bring that up and name that I think focusing on some of the challenges and limitations could help us build consensus. It's like you were really kicking the wheels of cost of homelessness studies with this one. What do you think about how I put that?
Yeah, it's not very popular to come out and say, well, actually, Housing First is not cost saving in a way a lot of proponents have been saying.
Like it won't always pay for itself.
Yeah, the way we've tried to reframe the debate, and we're not the only ones to have done it that way, is to say, look, why should we expect an intervention that gets people out of the street, greatly improves their quality of life? Why should we require that such an intervention pay for itself? If, let's say, a 70-year-old man shows up at the emergency room having a heart attack, and they're having a heart attack because they've had a terrible diet all their life, they haven't exercised, and they've smoked, we don't ask the question, should we treat this person or not? Is it going to be cost saving for society to treat this person? We don't. We're just going to treat them, often in very expensive ways. We're going to do bypass surgery, whatever it takes to save that person. And I mentioned an example of someone who had not had ideal lifestyle factors preceding their heart attack, because in recognition of the fact that there's this prevalent idea in our society that, well, homeless people are homeless because it's their fault. They made some bad life choices. They took drugs when they shouldn't have, etc. The reality is that in many instances, people had enormous disadvantages. The data is very clear like that. Far more adverse childhood experiences among homeless people by and large than in the general population. And people don't choose the families they're born into. While some people may have made some bad choices, by and large, there are people who had a lot of disadvantage to begin with. So in order to be consistent in the way we treat people who need healthcare and the way we treat people who are experiencing another grave threat to their well-being, which is homelessness, we should be ready to spend some money to improve their situation without asking ourselves whether this is going to pay for itself. In healthcare, we regularly spend money without any expectation of that this is going to save money down the road. And so why should we set that standard in addressing homelessness? We can maybe touch on that a bit more in depth later on, but what it does mean is that it really doesn't cost that much overall to provide care that is really beneficial for people, sort of beyond just the fact of being housed. The nature of their life changes. So there's a real benefit for a lot of people. And the net cost is really not that much. But I think there's another way to think about it, which is that even though we may be spending somewhat more money, we're spending it in a smarter way. In Quebec, a few months ago, the Quebec coroner released a report into the death of an Indigenous homeless man who, in January 2021, during the pandemic, when there was actually a curfew in Montreal, took refuge in a chemical toilet and froze to death in that chemical toilet. The coroner looked in detail at what had preceded that man, whose name was Raphael André, what had preceded his death, and she found that there were like 4,000 pages of notes from different doctors and other staff who had been in contact with him in a variety of institutions and settings over the previous, I forget exactly how many years, but he had touched the healthcare system at many points, and this connects a little bit with your interview with Dr. Forchuk. And a lot of that was just very disconnected care. If he had been followed by a Housing First team, which he was not, I think one could confidently expect that there would have been far fewer pages of notes, that there would have been a lot of substitution of care by different service providers. Instead of all these different service providers providing care, much more of it would have been given by the Housing First team, especially if it was an assertive community treatment team with a psychiatrist and nurses who were part of the team. So we're really just spending money in a more intelligent way than is the case with the status quo. It reminds me a little bit of what a friend of mine said many years ago in a discussion about furniture. And he said, the most expensive kind of furniture is cheap furniture because it's not going to last. You're going to have to replace it. It's not even worth making cheap furniture, really. You should make it right the first time and it'll last a long time. So similarly, like if it's worth providing care, let's provide it well. If I can just add a little bit, people vary in the extent to which they're costly. Even people with a high level of need, one person will be needing ambulance transport many, many times a year, using the ER, getting arrested, etc. But another person who has, let's say, paranoid schizophrenia and wants to avoid contact with human beings as much as possible might be living under a bridge and being absolutely reluctant to go to an ER. Their health may be deteriorating quickly, but they're not costing money. So if we start giving care to this person, well, their quality of life is going to go up, but costs are going to go up too.
And that's another important consideration with the Housing First intervention is that there were cost offsets, even though many people were connected to services, to income support, to health services through the Housing First program itself. So in a lot of ways, the new costs were really good. It was really important that people were accessing those services.
Yes, the cost offsets are composed of, I would say, three things. There are services that people were receiving before that they no longer need to receive because of the intervention. Like people don't need to sleep in an emergency shelter if they now have an apartment. In addition, there are rationalizations that happen. The team is able to forestall a crisis, perhaps by using a harm reduction approach to managing their substance abuse, able to avoid the person, let's say, getting so drunk that they need to be taken by ambulance to the emergency room. So there's rationalization of services that saves money as well. So it's substitution, rationalization of services. But on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, what can also happen is that the team discovers the person needs a form of healthcare that they hadn't been getting. Like I remember one case of somebody where the team discovered that they had hepatitis C and put them through 2 cycles of interferon B therapy at the hospital. That was the standard treatment at the time. So that cost quite a bit of money. But after those 2 cycles of treatment, the person was cleared of hepatitis C. And if they stayed that way from that point on, well, that would have really prolonged their life and avoided some healthcare costs down the road.
So when Housing First is working well, there's substitution where people don't need some of the services they had before. There's rationalization where they're able to get treatment in a way that is more efficient and effective, responsive to them. And then also they're able to access services that they need and that they weren't able to. So why is it important for Housing First interventions to not only focus on people who are costing more already?
That's a very good question. There have been, notably in the United States, in healthcare services in general, there have been efforts to identify the really high-cost individuals and target an intervention on those people where you're really likely to save money. Pardon me?
The $1 Million Murrays.
The $1 Million Murrays, but you can also do that with, for example, people with diabetes. Some of them don't manage their diabetes very well and end up costing quite a bit. So you could target an intervention at high-cost users. I mean, if your goal is simply to better manage your expenditures, it totally makes sense to target the highest cost users. In fact, right now in Canada, there's an initiative along those lines at University Health Network in Toronto where Dr. Andrew Buzari is spearheading an effort to identify kind of repeat emergency room users, high-cost users, as a prescription to reduce the impact they're having on the hospital, to house them in a residence that was built for that purpose, done house. That has a certain logic. And when we designed the at-home Chez Soi study, and I remember that meeting, we hoped that the study would show that the intervention was actually cost-saving, because obviously it's a somewhat easier sell if you say that it's actually cost-saving. But we considered the fact that we had greater chances of showing it would be cost-saving if we concentrated the intervention, if we targeted the highest cost users. But we decided not to do that because we figured there were some people who had very high needs, such as I mentioned, like a person with paranoid schizophrenia, sleeping under a bridge, avoiding everybody, who very much needed help, just as much as somebody who was a very high-cost user. So really, it was out of ethical considerations that we told ourselves, no, we really should address the intervention to people who need it, regardless of whether they're high-cost users to begin with.
This study that you did, this large study, was following people over 24 months. What do you think would have happened if the study design was looking over a longer time period, 5 years, or even 10 years? What might you see in terms of people's stability and health, but also the cost efficiencies and cost savings over that time? It's a bit of speculation, but what do you think?
Yeah. Well, actually, I asked a former student, Hannah Rochon, to do what's called a Markov model on the Montreal data and estimate what would have happened extrapolating to a 10-year horizon. So necessarily, when you do this kind of modeling exercise, you have to make some assumptions. And one assumption we did make, but there was some support for that assumption in some data, was that over a period of time, a number of individuals would require less intensive supports. They would become somewhat more autonomous. So the cost of the intervention would reduce for them while they would remain stably housed. So with this sort of assumption, which, by the way, did have kind of some support from the 6-year follow-up of the Toronto site Housing First study, she estimated that Housing First participants were housed about 1,500 days more over 10 years than treatment as usual participants, yet cost about $27,000 less over 10 years. So the intervention over time seemed indeed to become like cost saving. Control group participants, instead of getting housed and requiring fewer and fewer services, were just spending more time than the Housing First participants in expensive forms of unstable housing, such as emergency housing and substance abuse treatment. And the French team also did a modeling study. They took a longer time horizon. They used a somewhat different approach and somewhat different assumptions. They had found that the cost of the intervention was completely offset by the cost savings. And over time, they had a small cost per day housed, a few euros. But that was really far into the future. And I think the further out in time we go in modeling studies, the more uncertain the results are. But the bottom line is kind of one way or the other, kind of there's a suggestion that in the long run, we're not really going to have to spend any more money. And that's without taking into account all the social benefits of reducing homelessness, which Dennis Culhane in your earlier episode described in some detail.
Yeah, thanks for that. So to summarize, when you do take a longer time horizon, you start to see bigger cost offsets in general because of the long-term benefit for the people who are housed. So
that seems very likely.
With these results from the at-home Chez Soi study, what was the response from government, and did they make any policy changes based on your findings?
Yes, there was a significant initial policy change by the Harper government that was announced in 2013. That was partly motivated, as I understand it, by the economic findings that were encouraging, there were at least significant cost offsets. And the policy change was to reorient close to 65% of the funding under a program that was called the Homelessness partnering secretariat toward Housing First programs. However, there's a subtlety here, and that is that I've talked about high need participants and moderate need participants, and how the high need participants, who were all people with psychotic illness and had lower levels of functioning, etc., needed a more intensive intervention that involved a psychiatrist and normally nurses on the team as well. So this is a kind of service that wouldn't be delivered by the nonprofit sector in Canada normally, but rather by the formal healthcare sector. And the federal government, as I understand it, did not want to fund that kind of team because they're really stepping into the organization of healthcare services when they're doing that. And healthcare in Canada is under provincial jurisdiction. So the federal government decided, no, we'll fund Housing First teams that are in a nonprofit sector, basically. And I don't know as well what happened in other Canadian provinces. I know Quebec pretty well. And in a Quebec context, what happened was it was exclusively the nonprofit sector that got money to fund Housing First teams for people with moderate needs. But the provincial government did not step in and realize that, the Adam Chez Soi study showed that Housing First with assertive community treatment works well for people with severe mental illness and low levels of functioning. So we should set up some teams who are going to do that. There are some ACT teams that do follow some people who are homeless in Quebec, but as part of their caseload, they're not dedicated to that, to my knowledge, except for one in Montreal that is a bit unusual in that last I heard, they kept people for only 2 years to make room for new people. So there was a bit of a vacuum. And as I understand it, that situation has caused a bit of a difficulty across the country. To some extent, some of the moderate need teams were pretty expert. I'm thinking of one in particular in Montreal, run by the nonprofit Diogène, that really specializes in people with mental illness, have been able to provide services to people with really severe mental illness who would have been followed by an ACT team in At Home Chez Soi, but that's not very typical.
So there were some policy changes under the Harper government to prioritize Housing First. But there is at least two limitations. One is that there wasn't new funding. They just required that existing funding was diverted towards Housing First. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes. That caused a lot of unhappiness among nonprofits for understandable reasons.
Yeah. And then the second one was that the most high need people who would presumably benefit the most, and there would also be the most cost savings, there was not funding for that because of the conflict in jurisdiction between the federal and provincial government. So those are two pretty big issues.
Those are indeed two significant issues.
Recently, you were working on a study of the cost of homelessness in Quebec. And given that it's so recent, are there any learnings that you can share from that research at this time?
Well, I'm not prepared to share at this point kind of our estimate of the total cost over 1 year that we obtained. But in the course of trying to estimate the costs of various pieces of what homelessness represents in the province, I had a few conversations that raised a disturbing possibility, which I've kind of discussed with other people in the field, and which I think may be more than a possibility, but even a probability. And that is that when people become homeless, whether they stay in encampments or in other locations where there's a concentration of homeless people, they tend to become the targets of drug pushers. And the two main types of drugs that people will take are opioids, about which much has been said, which can lead to fatal overdoses. But it's I think less well known that opioids can also lead to brain damage, that the person experiences hypoxia in unpredictable parts of their brain, different from episode to episode, and gradually their cognitive abilities diminish. And the other class of drugs which people will take to protect themselves against aggression, to feel more alert, is amphetamines, and notably at this point in time, crystal meth, which is, of course, produced in labs. So a disadvantage of crystal meth from the point of view of managing having homeless people in a public space is that people can become quite aggressive. I was told of a story of a homeless man under the influence of this type of drug, as I understood it, who entered a bathroom in a hotel in Montreal and caused $50,000 worth of damages. There was another instance of an individual who caused the entire Eaton Centre, which is not nearly as large as the one in Toronto, but is still a pretty large 9-story shopping mall in downtown Montreal, caused the whole shopping mall to be evacuated after he started spraying people with a fire extinguisher and calling the fire department and so on. And there are also reports of damage to private property, etc. So on the one hand, we're engendering this considerable cost to property, which causes businesses to hire security guards, which for one center I was told about costs $2 million a year added to their budget. So on the one hand, you're doing that, but at the same time, people are losing their cognitive abilities. So I visited a residential center in Ottawa run by Shepherd of Good Hope, which is for people who, I was told, don't have the cognitive ability to be able to live independently in an apartment with the support of a Housing First team. So I think it's worth investigating to what extent is our allowing homelessness to keep on rising as we're doing in Canada, generating for ourselves downstream an enormous cost in the form of people who are exhibiting a lot of aggressive behavior in a public space, cannot be housed relatively economically in their own apartment with the support of a mobile team that's only there a little bit of the time, but need instead to be receiving care on a 24-hour, 7 days a week basis. So I think that's worth looking at. And to the extent that this possibility is borne out, I think it really raises the stakes and makes it even more urgent for us to find ways to house people more quickly.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, the impact of homelessness on the people experiencing it and the different costs of that. And that's something that I'm hoping to explore more, that people who are homeless are victims of crime, they're victims of assault and sexual assault at really high levels and causes really serious damage to
That
their
too,
futures.
absolutely.
And those are some good examples, including the destruction of a very expensive bathroom, apparently. My bathroom's not worth $50,000, I don't think. Moving a little bit back to your cost analysis, cost offsets, and making some comparisons to other studies. You were sharing with me that there was a large Housing First randomized trial in France. You brought it up for a second. And what did they find, and how is it different or the same to your study?
Well, the French study was conducted just a little bit after the Canadian at-home Chez Soi study, and there were some pretty close links between the French researchers and a number of the Canadian researchers, including myself. And they use kind of very similar instruments, very similar criteria for choosing who would enter into the study in a similar intervention. What was different was that whereas the Canadian study had both moderate need and high need participants and 2 randomized control trials per city, except for Moncton. In France, there were 4 cities, and in each city there was just 1 randomized trial for a group who were equivalent to our high need participants. So in a lot of ways, very comparable, which makes it interesting to compare it with the Canadian study, but there was that really big difference that they were targeting specifically high need participants. So the 4 cities, by the way, were Marseille, Toulouse, which is in the south of France, Paris, and Lille further north. And their economic analysis used a similar approach. They also added all costs, subtracted employment income as we did. But contrary to our study, they found that over 24 months, the costs for the Housing First group were virtually the same, like to a few euros difference between the Housing First and the control group. So, of course, one wonders, why this difference?
So the cost of the program was fully offset by the service savings that they measured.
That's correct. That's correct. And so I spent a bit of time trying to understand, by looking at their data compared to our data, what was different. The 2 main factors that emerge are Kind of the minor one is that even though hospitalization costs in France, hospitalization days were similar at baseline between our Haining group and their Haining group as well, the reduction in hospital days was somewhat greater in France. But mostly what we saw was there was a sharper reduction in the costs of housing, of the usual services, housing services. So evidently, the control group was getting more expensive, sort of standard, non-permanent housing than in Canada, so there was a greater opportunity to reduce it. At least that would seem to be like the main reason why that would have been the case. So it does
I
tell
see.
us that the context will vary. And by the way, I mentioned earlier that the costs of services for the control group were about $30,000 per year in Moncton, whereas they were approaching $60,000 per year in Toronto. In fact, what we see in the Canadian data is kind of the bigger the city, the higher the usual services cost. So different cities, depending on kind of their size, the size of the homelessness population, decisions made, no doubt at the provincial level, at the municipal level, will affect kind of what is the array of services that people receive. And that in turn will affect what happens to the use of those services and the cost of those services when you introduce housing first. So it's not simple.
For example, just hypothetically, if in France they have more services, more emergency services that are easier to access in some ways, they could be spending more money on the homeless group. And so the cost savings would be better once people were more stable. So the cost of the intervention would be offset. Whereas in some parts of Canada, maybe the savings wouldn't be as big. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't help people be housed, right?
Right.
Now,
Right.
moving on to another European example, a lot of people talk about Finland as
Uh-huh.
a country that has done the most to make a dent in homelessness.
Uh-huh.
What do you think happened in Finland that made it so that they could take the approach that they did? What's different about the approach that they're taking in Finland?
So I've been to Finland, talked to some of the people there over a relatively short period of time with my colleague and friend Tim Aubrey, but I can just summarize what I've pieced together from readings and conversations with people there. So, as I understand it, it started in the 1980s when homelessness in Finland was much more significant than it is today, and really very significant even by Canadian standards today. And there was some very cold winters during which a number of people who were sleeping outside froze to death. And that generated a national conversation that led to the decision that even though the government in power at the time was kind of the conservative variety by Finnish standards, they thought it was just worth it to just make it so that there wouldn't be all these homeless people on parks, on city benches, etc. And so they started around 1986, 87 to try to reduce homelessness in a systematic way. And the first thing they did was they started converting emergency shelters into permanent housing. And over time, that morphed into building more non-market housing. And at this point in time, about 13% of the housing stock in Finland is non-market, which means it's less expensive and it's protected from financialization pressures, from being bought out by companies like Blackstone that will try to evict people and raise the rents.
For comparison, Canada has, half of that.
Even less than half of that. Canada is about 4 to 5%, as I understand it. So that's part of it. They have more housing stock that is non-market, and they've developed particular mechanisms for their setting to finance the development of this type of housing. And it's held both by municipal governments and by entities such as the Y Foundation, which started very small and now has, I forget how many thousands of units of non-market housing. I should say, too, that this non-market housing exists both as congregate housing, 30, 50, 70, sometimes more than 100 units in a single building. And in other instances, it takes the form of scattered site housing. So whereas the housing first model, as it's conceived of in North America and in some European countries that are following more the Sam Tsemberis being the originator of the Housing First model as we usually understand it. So there are European countries that tend to follow that approach and put greater emphasis on scattered site housing because it more often corresponds to the preferences of homeless individuals. Finland has taken a somewhat different route and has a greater proportion of congregate non-market housing. So that's one difference. What happened is that by about 2008, so for the first 20 years with this approach, they were steadily reducing homelessness. But then they reached a kind of plateau and they started wondering, okay, what do we need to do now to further reduce the number of homeless people? And that's when they adopted housing first in a form of being more proactive, finding people who are homeless, and regardless of whether they have addictions issues, helping them to enter housing. There's a documentary one can see on YouTube where you see like social workers in a municipal government who find out that a few young people have been sleeping in a forest. It's a winter month. You can still see snow on the ground, and they actually go to the forest to try to find these individuals and bring them in. So you have this more proactive approach. And then there's two other important elements to mention. One is housing benefits are much higher in Finland than they are in Canada. So the aim is to make housing affordable for low-income individuals. And they have a fairly sophisticated formula for determining the magnitude of the housing benefit, which depends on several factors, including where you are in Finland and the age of the building and so on. I'm actually quite impressed to see a fairly small country like that have a government that's able to come up with such a sophisticated formula for allocating housing benefits. So that's another important factor. And then finally, they're putting quite a bit of emphasis on prevention. And they've been expanding progressively a system of housing advisors who are people that you can call if you're at risk of losing your housing and who will sort of really try to assess what is going on. I heard of an example of someone who, after several phone calls, it emerges that kind of the issue is that this person should be able to pay for their housing. They're working, they're earning enough money for the rent, but they have a gambling issue. And that gambling issue has led them to fall into several months arrears on their rental payments, and they're at risk of being evicted for that reason. So the housing advisors talk to people in the municipal government, which at the time was still the seat of a lot of social services, much like in England. So talk to the municipal government and make a deal that in exchange for this person agreeing to attend a Gamblers Anonymous program will have his rent arrears paid on a once-in-a-lifetime basis by the municipal government. So we have somewhat different systems in Canada. Rent banks where we'll loan you the money to pay your rent arrears, and then kind of you'll have to pay it back, which is maybe in some ways a better idea, I think. But anyway, that's what I heard was kind of the way this could work in Finland. So it's really a multi-pronged approach, which is as it should be. But a very important part of it is ensuring that people are actually able to pay for housing, which is, of course, for more and more people in Canada, unfortunately, not what's happening at present.
Well, thank you also for introducing what's going on in Finland. That's something we're going to look into a little bit more, and you provided me with a name I can follow up with. And some of the things that they're doing are things that have been coming up over and over, like deeper housing benefits. Steve Pomeroy suggested that. Of course, more non-market housing. That's part of his proposal as well. And prevention is the most cost-effective approach. And there's all kinds of ways that different levels of government can do that. Now, we know about those ideas, but when you talked about the history of addressing homelessness in Finland, there was a political decision that was made, presumably because there was a broad public consensus that that decision should be made. You share with me a study that looked at the willingness of different publics in different countries in Europe to pay for reducing homelessness. And there was a big range in Scandinavia. 3/4 of people said they were willing to spend taxpayer money to end homelessness. And in Italy, it was like only a third. So the political will is like connected to the public's willingness to support those decisions. So, what kind of argument, to start to conclude here, would you make to the listeners and to the public about the moral imperative to invest in ending homelessness?
At the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness conference last year in Ottawa in October, Mark Horvath described a survey in which it emerged that there's a number of individuals who are not at all moved by arguments about the harm that homeless people experience and are more responsive to arguments that we really would prefer to live in cities where there are not so many encampments and homeless people. And I think it was Steve Pomeroy in your earlier podcast who was expressing the hope that the presence of encampments and parks in cities such as Toronto would lead more people to come to the conclusion that we really need to spend some more money to address the problem of homelessness. I think that is a possibility, and every argument that can be put forward to bring a larger number of people to see the importance of addressing homelessness, I think is worth putting forward. That said, as someone with a background in health economics, I am struck by the fact that as a society, we have agreed to spend a lot of money on healthcare. And in many instances on healthcare, that doesn't arguably do a whole lot of good. For example, prescribing statins to a lot of people in their 90s is probably not going to change their health outcome very much. End of life cancer drugs can cost a great deal of money. And while in some cases, some people may really value being able to prolong their life a little longer, even though their health status is really not very good. They're not feeling very well. So there gets a point where the benefit is really very small in relation to the cost. And I should point out, too, that when somebody shows up at the emergency room and let's say they're experiencing a heart attack, doctors are not going to assess whether the person was a smoker, whether they had an unhealthy diet, whether they exercised or not. They're going to treat them regardless. So to me, that's kind of relevant to the argument that some people will put forward that, well, if you're homeless, it's your fault. You made some bad life choices, so you're just reaping the consequences of those bad life choices. We just don't reason that way when we dispense healthcare in our country and in virtually all industrialized countries. Even insured people in the United States, that question won't be asked. So I think just from the point of view of being equitable in how we allocate resources, I just cannot see how it can be viewed as consistent to spend a lot of healthcare dollars in those kinds of situations. But on the other hand, when we see people who are homeless, whose situation can be improved markedly at relatively low cost, and there's not that many homeless people at this point in Canada, but we would choose to not spend the money, to me doesn't make any sense. And we've talked about the magnitude of the cost offsets and do the cost offsets equal the cost of the intervention or not. We've reviewed how really that's going to depend on the context. It's going to depend on whether you're delivering housing first to people who are high cost to begin with or not so high cost. We can haggle over these details, but at the end of the day, we're talking about people whose quality of life has become abysmal. And at worst, it's not going to cost us very much to at least provide them with decent housing and the supports that they need.
What do you think are the most important steps for us to take now to end homelessness?
I think it's helpful to think of homelessness, and I think Dennis Culhane said much the same thing, as a stock and flow problem. So people are not born homeless, usually. It does happen, unfortunately. But by and large, people become homeless later in their lives in Canada. If they remain homeless, if they're not able to get out of it, which is a minority of situations, you're increasing the number of homeless people that way. And as more and more people become homeless, unless you're able to help those who are stuck in homelessness to re-enter housing, you're just going to have more and more homeless people. So there's really two basic sorts of things we can do to reduce homelessness. One is to increase the rate at which we help people who are currently stuck in homelessness get out of it. And the other one is to prevent people from becoming homeless in the first place. So I would say we know much better how to help people who are stuck in homelessness, who are chronically homeless, how to help them become housed again. That's basically housing first. Then we know how to prevent people from being homeless. So we have a lot of examples of programs that have some effectiveness. It's just that there's a lot of different pathways into homelessness. So really, you need a lot of different mechanisms to prevent entry into homelessness from all of these different pathways. There are generic pathways that address a lot of different populations that I think can be very helpful and that exist to a greater degree in some U.S. cities, in Finland, and that's basically programs to help prevent evictions. For example, there's a large one called Home Base in New York City. So there's a number of mechanisms in prevention that exist that we could develop further in Canada on the prevention side. On the exit side, well, it's housing first. And there, I think the key things, if I could wave a magic wand and make them happen, are A, get more funding to increase the stock of affordable apartments into which housing first clients could be placed. B, increase funding so we can fund more social workers, human services workers, as they would be called in the US, to staff housing first teams, including some assertive community treatment teams. So dedicate some funding for psychiatrists and nurses and such professionals for those teams so that we could also address the people who have severe mental illness on the streets and work on mechanisms to provide technical support and training to housing first teams so that their fidelity to the housing first model is assessed regularly and feedback is given to them if they're not really following the model, and they can gradually achieve higher fidelity. So those are the main things that I'm thinking of at present. I suppose I'll add one more in the realm of generic prevention, and I'm not the first to say that. The Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness has been advocating for this as well, but that's to increase the amount of housing benefits so that people who have lower incomes are better able to pay for housing that's become like really, really expensive.
Thank you so much for joining us, Eric. It's been a real pleasure helping us look at the biggest study that's ever been done on housing first, and also to compare that to other studies around the world that were similar and helping understand the cost offset, what the long-term savings could be to government, and the long-term improvements in people's lives. Those are all really complicated ideas. So I really appreciate you sharing that with us.
Thank you very much, Tristan. I appreciate your interest in the topic.
Okay, we'll talk soon.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Take care.
This episode of Policy Crimes was produced with Lena Moskaleva and CJ Tremblay. Original music by Matt Hayter. This podcast is a project of the Publication Cooperative. If you have thoughts, feedback, or ideas, you can email us at policycrimes@thepublication.ca. Thanks for listening. See you next time.